In 1954, social psychiatrist Dr. Frederick Wortham published Seduction of the Innocent, The Influence of Comic Books on Today's Youth. It was a flashpoint for the comic book industry. Wortham had actually been speaking out for years on what he perceived to be the dangers of comics, rather unsuccessfully. He was far from the only opponent of comics in the early 50s, but his book allowed him to become the poster boy for the supposed illicit influence on kids. Comic books, he argued, would turn your kids into dope-smoking, Satan-worshipping, crime-committing homosexuals. Now, comic books are cool, but unfortunately they're not that cool. Dr. Wortham's claims are seen by most these days as greatly exaggerated, if not outright quackery. But his voice was part of a chorus that led to the Comics Magazine Association of America adopting the Comics Code Authority in 1954. The Comics Code was a draconian list of rules that severely limited what kinds of content could appear in comics in the name of protecting the most impressionable readers from injuring their sensibilities and producing wholesome entertainment. Only comic books approved by the code would bear the seal approved by the Comics Code Authority in the corner, and wholesale distributors would not carry comic books without the seal. So while submitting your comics to the code for approval was technically voluntary, it was functionally mandatory if you wanted them to sell. The seal was powerful, and as Dr. Amy Kist Nyberg at the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund puts it, nothing inherent in the form of comics prevents comic books from telling stories for different audiences, but the perception of comic books as juvenile literature was reinforced by the Comics Code. The Comics Code was in place for decades. I even remember seeing it on some of the books available when I started reading comics in 2001. Looking back 70 years later, the Code is a great example of how censorship, even if it can be well-meaning, is not only restrictive, but actually anti-art. The 1954 Code was extremely confining, prohibiting lurid illustrations, scenes of violence and gore, and most depictions of sexuality. There are a few standards I'm not necessarily against. For example, it didn't allow comics to ridicule or attack racial groups. But most of the code was backward and puritanical. It banned using the words horror or terror in titles, stated that respected institutions and parents should never be questioned, and it criminalized slang and poor grammar. It famously barred comics writer Marv Wolfman from being credited, seeing as his name looked too similar to the word Wolfman. The Comic Book Legal Defense Fund has compiled quite a few examples of the code modifying art, which frequently changed the flow of the comic and kneecapped its impact. I love to use these as examples of the dangers of censorship when I celebrate Banned Books Week annually with my students. In this first example, you can see that the code objected to this female lounge singer character's neckline, and the code-approved redraw brought her dress up several inches. The code sometimes demanded art like this be redone, but sometimes it just did slipshod jobs like erasing a line denoting a woman's cleavage, leaving a somewhat awkward space in a panel. Here, you can see that quite a bit of the violence was taken out of this alien invasion story as part of the exclusion of scenes depicting quote-unquote excessive violence. I think it's worth pointing out that not only does the word balloon at the top not really make sense with the redrawn art, are the 12-foot-tall aliens firing on the crowd? But the flow of the panel is entirely changed. Instead of your eye naturally finding the word balloon, then moving to the alien and flowing downward with the ray gun blast, ultimately landing on the crowd that's running away, there's just this big emptiness where there's no movement or used space at all. Instead, there's lots of ground shown between this alien and the now somewhat awkwardly placed characters in the foreground. The fluid movement from the top of the panel to the bottom is eliminated entirely. And at least for me, the redrawn panel feels much more still and lifeless than the original. This next one might be my favorite because the resulting redraw is so phenomenally awkward. I suppose that doctors would count as respected institutions, which means that they can't be disrespected by choking them out. It's permissible, however, to show someone stealing from them, apparently. The thing that really puts it over the top is the edits to the middle panels. Instead of seeing your first-person hands on the optometrist's neck, You get these impossibly placed hands, with the optometrist somehow stroking his chin as he thinks. However, his elbows look like they must be about 4 feet away from him, as his right hand touches his chin and his left hand floats strangely high in the air. Then in the next panel, the shot is awkwardly framed down to his chin, and he's noticeably still blue, despite his airway being a code-approved unimpeded. The text of the story is now fundamentally different from the one the writer and the artist submitted. And if you look closely in the redraw, you can see that the color plates haven't changed. You can still see echoes of his frown from getting choked out, and you can see the blue from where his tie was in the original. The final example I'd like to share is baffling. When I'm talking the comics code with my high school students, I like to show my students the pre-code Nick Fury submission on the left, and have them guess what was too salacious for the code to allow. They usually zero in on the smoke, the disembodied lips, or the proximity of the characters when they're shown together. But believe it or not, it's the phone being off the hook that the comics code would not allow. A sensual embrace is okay, as are guns, lit cigarettes and ashtrays, and swinging 60s clothing, but a phone off its hook was far too sexy for them. Your guess why is as good as mine. When Conan the Barbarian burst onto the comic scene at the end of 1970, the code was still in strong effect. It was revised and slightly loosened that year, allowing for some horror, magic, and sword and sorcery elements to re-enter the comic landscape. Conan historian Jeffrey Shanks opines that code administrators seeing Conan comics might have signaled to them that the comic landscape was changing, and may have helped hasten the loosening of the code. Without those changes, it's tough to imagine that a Conan comic could really be possible. Whereas the 1954 code banned most of the darker aspects of fantasy stories, like The Walking Dead, vampires, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolfism, the 1971 revision of the code allowed them when, quote, in the classic tradition of works like Dracula and Frankenstein. This opened the door for common Conan tropes like undead sentries protecting a treasure. Those classic Conan the Barbarian comics by Roy Thomas, Barry Windsor Smith, and John Buscema are excellent, but they're definitely more buttoned up than their source material. I wouldn't hesitate to hand one of those Conan the Barbarian issues to like a 10-year-old, since the fantasy violence isn't overly intense, at least not more than a He-Man or Thundercats cartoon. They're largely bloodless, but Robert E. Howard's original literary barbarian didn't shy away from intense depictions of violence, lurid depictions of magic and the occult, and gratuitous sex appeal. No actual sex scenes, though, weirdly. So unless you had only known Conan through the 1970s comics, something felt like it was missing. Roy Thomas has spoken openly in recent decades about how much of a pain it was to deal with the comics code as a writer, and how he and his artists sometimes pressed their luck in getting code approval. He recalls how code approval sometimes vexed him. Actually, the thing that gave me the most pause was the way that John garbed Helgi, the damsel in distress of the month, in a short vest open between her ample breasts. I had visions of the comics code insisting, after the story was all ready to go, that she be redrawn in a cardigan sweater. Fortunately, that didn't happen. Not only were comics loosening up a bit by the early 70s, but code head Leonard Darvin once told me he allowed things to slip by in Conan that he wouldn't have in other superhero mags because he suspected the former had a somewhat older average audience. When putting on his writer's cap, Roy certainly wanted the freedom to tell stories in ways he thought were best. But Roy was also the editor of the book, so he knew he had to play things carefully when working around or outright pushing against the comics code. They sometimes acquiesced in ways that didn't make them completely happy. Roy notes how it's a little awkward that Conan's sword seems to explode off enemies rather than cut them on the second page of issue number 1. They leave some things implied, like the character Jenna's status as a sex worker. And sometimes they would even outright note to one another in the margins, "Hope the comics code doesn't cut this." In Conan number 9, when a character is dropped into a patch of man-eating flowers, they devour the guy without any of the violence technically being shown. As the flowers eat him, their color changes from white and pink to blood red. The code normally would have objected to violence like this, seeing as they had access to the color notes on the pages. Had Roy written, as the flowers eat him, they turn red with his blood, it wouldn't have flown. Lucky for the creative team, the colorist on the book was Maddie Cohen, who happened to be dating the artist, Barry Windsor Smith. Instead of writing directions for her on the page, he was able to give her color notes verbally, and the code censors were left in the dark as to their true intentions. Conan number 10 features a kill scene, which the Robert E. Howard original specifically says involves Conan decapitating his enemies, but Roy knew that would never fly under the code. Instead, Barry decided to have the Cimmerian deliver the killing blow out of frame and then show the evil priest of Anu's head in profile, and his obese body is conveniently not where it would be in the frame if his head were still attached to it. An inclusion by omission, which Roy Thomas says allowed readers to draw their own conclusions. The code didn't seem to notice. The code did notice that Conan wasn't punished for killing a priest of all people, though. Roy countered with the fact that he would be in a dungeon at the start of the next issue, with the real start to his Rogues in the House adaptation. But that wasn't good enough for code administrators. 3 caption boxes that previewed Conan's upcoming incarceration were added to the last few panels, at the code's behest. In Conan number 37, Roy remembers wringing his hands as he wondered if the code would object to one of Neil Adams' drawings of a gigantic slug monster looking a little bit like a vulva. The code apparently didn't think it was objectionable enough to ask for changes, and I'm glad they didn't. When I read that issue, it didn't even cross my mind that someone might object to it, but I've talked to other readers who noticed it immediately. The Conan creative team wasn't always successful at working around code censors. Included here is a panel from Conan number 58, which the code rejected, and its approved redraw is shown beneath. They didn't take issue with the scantily clad Belit's furry breeches or with the blind flood of desire, but instead found Conan's open legs objectionable. In the final drawing, Conan's legs are to one side, and he looks a bit to me like he's about to fall over. Elsewhere in that issue, Conan's censors had Roy Thomas change the mating dance of Belit into the love dance of Belit. Roy pushed back a bit. Aren't those the same thing? Well, love dance is general, they said. Mating dance is specific. Roy acquiesced. It's sad to me that the Marvel staff had to either strategize around the code, work actively to hide their true intentions, or censor their great work. Roy did occasionally censor his own stuff. He says he wasn't really out to ruffle feathers. He did so reluctantly, and he got away with what he could. Conan the Barbarian wasn't an instant success. The premiere sold pretty well, but then the next 6 issues lagged behind more popular books and trended downward. It was even canceled for about a day before the Marvel editors reversed their decision. But starting with issue 8, the series began a steady sales increase that meant it was safe from cancellation for a very long time. Around the time that Conan the Barbarian number 1 was premiering in 1970, Roy Thomas got a phone call from Stan Lee with an idea for a new book. It was for a series he wanted to call Savage Tales, and Stan outlined to Roy an idea that he had for a new character called Man-Thing, an intensely tragic character turned into a swamp monster. While fleshing out the story idea from Stan and sending it to writer Jerry Conway to script, Roy wasn't immediately sold on it. He felt that Man-Thing seemed too similar to the existing character The Heap, and that Marvel already had a popular hero named The Thing. Not to mention, the eventual title, Giant-Size Man-Thing, is hilarious in a way that would probably chafe against the code. The aspect that was unique about the book, though, is that it would be a black and white magazine-sized comic, which was something Marvel didn't have at the time. It wasn't a completely original idea. Warren Publishing had been putting out creepy and eerie comic magazines since the mid-1960s. The paper size was a little bit larger, they cost more than a regular comic, and, importantly, as a magazine, they were completely independent of the Comics Code Authority. Looking at early 70s comics side by side today, it's a little weird to think how restricted one was, while the other couldn't be touched by the code. The magazine dimensions are only about 3/4 of an inch larger than the height and width of a regular comic book. Brian Cronin at Comic Book Resources helps explain that it was essentially a stalking trick. Since magazines and comic books were racked in different places at the newsstand, a non-code magazine like Savage Tales wouldn't be sitting right next to a code-approved Batman comic. It makes sense that Man-Thing's origin story would need to appear in a comic outside the Comics Code approval. It's terribly sad, features less than glorious depictions of the government, and deals with drugs, corruption, and artist Gray Morrow draws a woman in basically transparent clothes. Essentially, it's everything the Code wasn't keen on. It is also dynamite. Those early Savage Tales stories featuring Man-Thing, Khazar the Jungle, and Conan the Barbarian are all wonderful Bronze Age nuggets of weird storytelling. They're so good. And in case the decapitated head on the cover wasn't a big enough clue, it was printed with a notice saying that this publication is rated M for the mature reader. It's a sort of anti-Comics Code seal. Stan originally wanted a King Cole story instead of Conan. Stan liked how names that started with a K looked on a cover, better than names that started with a C. Plus, they already had one Conan comic. Did they need two? For reasons unknown, Stan changed his mind and went with Conan. He and Cull are cut from the same cloth anyway. It makes sense that they would adapt the first chronological story, The Frost Giant's Daughter, for the first issue. It's a simple and effective episode, surprisingly brief at only 11 pages. Brevity was always a skill that both Robert E. Howard and Roy Thomas possessed, and one that I decidedly don't have. Roy's dialogue and Barry Windsor Smith's art in those 11 pages absolutely kick ass. Unfortunately, not everyone was as much of a fan of those early Savage Tales stories as I am. Marvel publisher Martin Goodwin, who'd been working in comics since 1929 and had been with Marvel since the very beginning, canceled the book after only one issue. Roy Thomas recalled the canceling in 2008 like this: "I never got all the inside story, but there were several things that led to Savage Tales being canceled after that first issue. Martin Goodman had never really wanted to do a non-code comic, probably because he didn't want any trouble with the CMAA over it. Nor did he really want to get into magazine format comics, and Stan really did. So Goodman looked for an excuse to cancel it. I also heard that we weren't able to sell the mag in Canada, which ordinarily would probably have taken maybe 10% of the print run, that somebody at the competition, DC or Warren or wherever, told the Canadians it was salacious material. But I never got any confirmation of that, and it may be an urban legend. At any rate, we had lots of returns of unsold copies due to poor distribution as much as anything. For several years, there were copies in a warehouse, and also for a time, sitting in the hallway at Marvel between Stan's office and the bullpen were hundreds of copies of number 1 in little bales of 50 or whatever. We were told to take home as many as we wanted just to clear them out. I eventually took some, as did others. In 1976, they helped finance my move to Los Angeles. By then, Savage Tales number 1 had become a collector's item, primarily because of the Conan story therein by Barry and me, but also because of the other features. Roy had a second Conan story for the next Savage Tales issue already in the works, but since the book was canned, he moved it over to Conan the Barbarian. As you may have expected, the Comics Code censors made them rework a considerable amount of art drawn for the female characters, which Roy notes would have been no problem in the black and white pages. For a few years, Savage Tales lay dormant while Roy, Barry, John, and others chugged away at making the Comics Code-bound Conan the Barbarian comic a success. Goodman eventually backed Stan Lee when Stan wanted to publish an anti-drug Spider-Man comic, which the Code denied. Marvel published the book anyway. Many people have noted that Stan may have gotten a little too much credit for his work in the 60s, frequently overshadowing collaborators who deserved more recognition, but Stan definitely took some principled, measured stands against the Comics Code, for which he should be lauded. Partially as a result of Stan's efforts, the Code began to loosen ever so slightly. Goodman retired from Marvel in 1972, and Stan assumed the role of publisher, which meant that he didn't need Goodman's approval for a certain black and white, magazine-sized book. Still, Stan had lots of new responsibilities as publisher and president of Marvel, so he handed the reins of Savage Tales and the editor-in-chief role to Roy Thomas. Most of the stories they had originally planned for the second issue had already been printed, so Roy asked if they could make Savage Tales a more Robert E. Howard-focused mag. Stan said yes. Proudly declaring that it was back by popular demand, Savage Tales number 2 hit stands in October of 1973, only 30 months after the first issue. This time, Conan was featured proudly on the cover, and the interior had an adaptation of the top-tier Robert E. Howard story, Red Nails. While the first issue had featured a Conan the Barbarian starring in tag above the title, issue 2 now read Savage Tales featuring Conan the Barbarian, with our Sumerian hero's name as large as the title itself. John Buscema's painted cover already hints that this is not a code-approved book, as it has a nude woman threatened by an executioner and some conveniently placed smoke obscuring her form. Any comic version of Red Nails would have had to look very different under the code. Roy Thomas and Barry Windsor-Smith's adaptation of it is extremely bloody and almost immediately features horrifying undead creatures. It's suggestively sexual. The words throbs and pulses appear together in that order, and the story is very critical of power structures. The climax of the narrative has one fairly steamy lesbianic scene as well, all wrapped around an attempt at human sacrifice. Red Nails was already one of Robert E. Howard's best Conan stories, but Roy's dialogue and Barry's intricate art really do live up to their charming claim on the title page that they adapted it with aplomb. Instead of the short 11 pages allotted for the Frost Giant's daughter in the first issue, Red Nails was a two-parter, spanning 21 pages for just its first installment. In addition to Red Nails, Barry Windsor-Smith also locked in to draw an illustrated version of Howard's poem Cimmeria and a full-page in-house ad. Roy convinced Robert E. Howard's agent, Glenn Lord, to write a biography of Howard for issue 2 as well. Savage Tales continued with Conan as the headline character for a few more issues, with the Cimmerian eventually sharing cover space with Khazar, Lord of the Hidden Jungle. Those first 5 issues feature painted covers by some of the best artists working in comics at the time, covers whose intensity really lived up to the title of the book. The mag was hugely successful. After issue 5, Conan was spun off into his own book, which would bear his name permanently in the title, The Savage Sword of Conan. Savage Sword was also unconstrained by the Comics Code, meaning it could live up to all the bloody promise of Robert E. Howard's original character. Whereas other Marvel characters played in the backup stories of Savage Tales, Roy Thomas saw Savage Sword as a Howard showcase and wanted to use characters like King Cole and Solomon Kane for the backups. According to Roy Thomas, when you were assigned to write a Marvel comic in the 70s, as soon as it was given to you, it was due yesterday, if not the day before. As such, getting assigned the first issue of Savage Sword meant a tight deadline, so he reluctantly repurposed the next few plots he had figured out for Conan and slotted them into the new title. It's a little awkward as a first issue. Conan meets up with Red Sonja, who he clearly has a history with, but what that history is will mostly be lost on the reader if they haven't read Conan number 23. I certainly hadn't when I first stumbled across Savage Sword, so I figured it was all to be left to my imagination. It is in this issue that Red Sonja acquires her signature chainmail bikini, which was far too revealing for a code-bound book like Conan the Barbarian, in which she wore a full-coverage, long-sleeve chainmail shirt. Savage Sword's first story, The Curse of the Undead Man, would continue in Conan number 43, which came out soon afterward. Roy lamented that since the black and white mag had a smaller readership than the color comic, some of its readers would miss the first half of the narrative, but people seem to have done okay. I think this kind of cross-pollination between books is much more acceptable in today's industry. The book was a success, Comics Code be damned, and Savage Sword would go on to run for more than 200 issues into the mid-90s. For many of the first 60 issues of Savage Sword of Conan, Roy adapted Howard's prose stories, but mixed in original yarns as well, jumping all over Conan's life. In addition to Roy Thomas and John Buscema, its place as an uncensored playground of storytelling attracted some of the greatest talent in comics, including fantasy artist Boris Vallejo, X-Men mastermind Chris Claremont, and my personal favorite Robin writer Chuck Dixon. But Roy Thomas has always remained its greatest creator. He returned to the book in its later years after what most readers would agree is a sag in quality, bringing the stories back up to their former glory for the final stretch of issues. Savage Sword is remembered as one of the peaks of the Bronze Age. While it was out of print for much of the 90s and 2000s, it's now been collected in omnibuses by Dark Horse, Marvel, and Titan Comics. The Comics Code was revised again in 1989, this time featuring much more sweeping changes. It was now presented within the text of the code as a sort of optional seal of approval for comics which you could feel confident giving to young kids, rather than the arbiter between wholesome quality and evil smut. The submission procedure was changed to allow more conversation between comic editors and code administrators. This time, editors could discuss with the administrator the concerns raised with him and reach agreement on how the code can properly bear the code seal without being revised or within a mutually agreeable set of alternate revisions. The standards were much more broad in the 1989 revision. They allowed for more nuance and reflected that times may change, making space for things like contemporary styles and fashions for characters' costumes. They still wanted to encourage wholesome lifestyles to be portrayed as desirable and for characters to be role models, but also actually acknowledge that there were comic books for adult readers. The members of the Comics Magazine Association of America include publishers who elect to publish comics that are not intended to bear the code seal, and that therefore need not go through the approval process described above. Among the comics in this category may be titles intended for adult readers. Member publishers hereby affirm that we will distribute these publications only through distribution channels in which it is possible to notify readers and distributors of their content, and thus help the publications reach their intended audiences. The member publishers agree to refrain from distributing these publications through those distribution channels that, like the traditional newsstand, are serviced by individuals who are unaware of the content of specific publications before placing them on display. By this time, comic books had reached a new level of maturity. Many of the tropes that are recognizable to modern readers had their progenitors around this time. The modern event book, like Secret Wars, the convoluting and then exploding of decades worth of continuity in Crisis on Infinite Earths, the long-form graphic novel and meta deconstruction of the superhero genre in Watchmen, heck, even the creation of comic book specialty shops. It would be difficult for anyone to argue at the time that comics were only for kids, and Conan helped solidify that. Conan had reached new heights too, with 2 major motion pictures and a Red Sonja movie, which seems like we can all agree to be the unofficial third in the trilogy. I don't know a single Conan fan who considers Arnold Schwarzenegger's character Calidor to actually be a separate character from Conan. The Comics Code was still in effect until 2011, but with gradually diminishing influence. Marvel pulled their books from approval in 2001 in favor of giving their titles a rating in-house. 10 years later, DC pulled theirs as well, and Archie was the final publisher to withdraw later that year. It quietly disappeared, and NPR's obituary for the code begins with the line, "I come to bury the Comics Magazine Association of America, not to praise it." The Comics Code isn't forgotten, but it's usually the butt of the joke these days. Tom Taylor and Bruno Redondo recently had me laughing out loud by using a Comics Code seal of approval look-alike as the censor bars when the villain Blockbuster gets cussed out at the end of Nightwing number 96. Titan Comics recently revived the Savage Sword mag for a new print run, which features some of the greatest writers and artists in comics today. It even throws back to classic Savage Sword artists like Joe Jusko doing painted covers again. Everyone loves it, and you should check it out. Every year, Banned Books Week falls somewhere in late September or early October. It's a celebration of our First Amendment right to read and an outward expression of resistance to censorship. It's celebrated by the American Library Association, the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, the National Council of Teachers of English, of which I am a card-carrying member, and more. That means that every year, I teach about the Comics Code to my students. We'll dissect book bans spearheaded by anti-free speech groups like Moms for Liberty. We'll evaluate the PMRC's censorship of music and the Parental Advisory Explicit Content label on music. We'll make the case for kids' right to have access to books. And if I have time, I get to bring up some great comic book creators and how they fought censorship with everyone's favorite sword and sorcery character.